This podcast is part of the Big Heads Media Podcast Network. Go to bigheadsmedia.com for more great podcasts.
Hello and welcome to Body Count, a history podcast where we gab about death and disaster through the ages, highlighting figures, single events, time periods, whatever it may be that resulted in someone, or as is usually the case, a lot of someone's dying. Now, I am your host, Jessica Manor, and as always, joined by my co-host,
Kara DiDomizio, and we are excited today. And why is that, Jessica?
Well, we are excited because I'm going to go ahead and throw it out there. One of the most prominent historians of the 20th century, I'm going to go ahead and say, has luckily joined us today, and I'm very excited about what he's talking about. He's got, as always, a new book out. Richard, go ahead and introduce yourself to our audience.
Okay, well, I'm Richard Toye. I'm a professor of modern history at the University of Exeter. I'm actually speaking to you from Venice, where I am teaching for a semester at Venice International University. And the book which I'm going to be talking about today is a book which I have edited with colleagues from elsewhere in the UK, Julie Gottlieb and Daniel Hucker. And the book is called The Munich Crisis, Politics and the People.
Well, that is certainly no slouch when you come on our show, as always. So tell us a little bit about, the overarching theme of the book, and then a little bit about your particular contribution and what you've written about and what you're getting into there.
Sure. So I think that, the Munich Crisis is one of the most famous events of the 20th century. If you think about the sort of iconic footage which you see over and over again, it's particularly Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain stepping down the steps at Hendon Aerodrome and saying, "I have in my hand a piece of paper," basically saying that Britain and Germany will never go to war. We know, of course, that this was falsified very quickly within a year. And so, but at the time, of course, this was a sort of a moment of optimism, a moment of great relief, because the context for this was the threat of war that had built up over several months previously, the long tension that had been present since Hitler had come to power in 1933. And it was this particular crisis over an area of Czechoslovakia called the Sudetenland, which Hitler wanted. Hitler wanted this territory, and he got it under the Munich Agreement, because the reason that he wanted it, or the reason he claimed he wanted it, was because there were ethnic Germans living in this area, and he claimed it was a great injustice that these people had to be living under the oppression of the Czechoslovakian state. Now, we shouldn't necessarily paint the Czechoslovakian state as perfect, but of course it was considerably better, really, than the Nazi regime, obviously. And so this was a moment which has sort of gone down in history, partly because of these sort of iconic episodes of Chamberlain saying, "I believe this is peace for our time," and waving from the balcony of Buckingham Palace and so on. This sort of looks retrospectively like the most sort of absurd, kind of disastrous decision. But it's also been remembered in different ways around the world, actually. And so the book brings together chapters. We've got chapters on Italy, we've got a chapter on the Soviet Union, we've of course got a chapter on Germany, we've got material on Britain, France, Hungary even, as well as Czechoslovakia. And so what we were trying to do is to take a less purely top-down approach than historians had often done in the past. This is often a story which has been told over and over again from the perspective of the high-level elite negotiations, Chamberlain flying backwards and forwards to and from Germany. But we felt that less was known about sort of ordinary people's reactions and, if you like, the psychology of the crisis. How did people feel about the fact that, as Chamberlain himself said, in a famous radio broadcast, that people were trying on gas masks and sort of digging trenches and preparing for war because of a dispute in a faraway country of which we know nothing. How did people feel about that, not only in the UK, but in all these different countries around the world?
That is fascinating, and it's a truly interesting approach, and something, like you said, again, that I haven't necessarily seen before. And God knows I've read enough books on this topic in and of itself. So let's get into a little bit about what specifically you were looking at, what you had in mind when you were writing.
Well, my chapter is specifically on Winston Churchill. And now, interesting choice, you might say, because Churchill, in some ways, didn't do a great deal during the Munich crisis because he wasn't in power. He was, of course, on the back benches, doubtless very, very frustrated at the situation. He made about 3 public statements during the crisis, essentially press releases, and he was very active behind the scenes trying to sort of mobilize the people who agreed with him and meeting them in people's flats and talking a lot. But he obviously wasn't directly involved in the negotiations themselves. So, why is he worth looking at? Well, I think that a very, very important thing about Churchill in this crisis is, well, what was his alternative? So let's say that you don't want to do a deal with Hitler. What do you do instead? And Churchill had for some months been promoting the idea of what he called a grand alliance between Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. And so really, and this was what he did during the crisis itself, was he basically made public statements saying we need to work together with France and the Soviet Union to give an ultimatum to Germany. And that is the way to solve the crisis, rather than giving in to Germany and letting Germany take Czech territory. Okay, so now one thing which is worth stressing is that Churchill wasn't saying let's start a war with Germany. He was actually thought that this was a way in which war with Germany could be avoided. So his theory was that if you present this ultimatum to Germany, then actually the German generals, the people in the army who weren't fully behind Hitler perhaps, would move to overthrow Hitler, and sort of kind of problem solved, right? Now, the difficulty with that logic is that the evidence that they were likely to do this, sort of retrospectively, really isn't that strong. There are always kind of people making noises about they might possibly do something, but to sort of rely on this was maybe not particularly wise. And in his memoirs, Churchill sort of probably exaggerated the evidence that this, if only we had done this, then everything could have been different, right? Now, so it's not an unreasonable approach in and of itself, but would this definitely have worked? I'm not really sure that it definitely would. And what if you try it and it doesn't work? Then you're still in the same situation of, well, are we going to go to war or not in this situation? So there's an obvious dilemma, and you can't blame Churchill for sort of not having 100% definitely sort of come up with the right answer. But I think that the question which was then in my mind was, okay, so Churchill is saying, this is a really important bit, Churchill is saying we're going to work with we should work with the Soviet Union, and yet what do we know about Churchill's attitude to the Soviet Union going back to 1917? Well, we know, of course, that he was powerfully anti-communist, and we know that in the aftermath of the revolution, he'd been a big advocate of British intervention on the side of the so-called white anti-Bolshevik forces, and so it looks really quite a strange, on the face of it. It looks like a strange move, this kind of really strong anti-Bolshevik politician saying, who should we work with? Why not Stalin? Okay, so interesting move there. Now, how do people explain this? Well, people have tried in the past to sort of deal with this by, on the one hand, they have said, well, Churchill was just a pragmatist, and so at the point where he thought that the Nazis were a greater threat to the British Empire than the Bolsheviks, then he decided to work with the Soviet Union. Well, that is true as far as it goes. But the question is, why had he made this calculation? Remember that in the post-war period, he had really believed that the Bolsheviks were working with Sinn Féin in Ireland, with nationalists in India, with nationalists in Egypt to kind of overthrow the British Empire. So as far as Churchill's big imperialist. So Churchill's obviously seeing this as a massive threat. Why then doesn't he think that this is such a serious threat in the 1930s? And you've got to remember that other people made different judgments. So Neville Chamberlain, we know, was quite aware, going back to the spring of 1938, of Churchill's idea of a Grand Alliance. And he says, well, yeah, that would be a nice idea if it would work. And he's obviously very, very skeptical that such a thing is really practical. So conservatives could reach very different conclusions. Even somebody, obviously Chamberlain was anti-communist, but he wasn't quite as a sort of obsessively anti-communist as Churchill had been in the immediate aftermath of World War One. So the question is then, why do people reach different conclusions about that? And what was the path whereby Churchill had decided that the Soviet Union was a kind of a viable partner? And that was what I'm trying to address in my chapter.
Oh, absolutely fantastic stuff, Richard, because honestly, it's just something I would have never considered, and I would have never approached it that way or looked at it that way. And I think it's kind of a new lens for people to look at, specifically this point in time in history. So let's get into a little bit, because I do think it is interesting why, particularly given Churchill's general attitude, what are some of the opposing approaches? Why maybe take the fascist stance or take the German stance versus the Bolsheviks? Why specifically do you see the alliance with what it is, and why did Churchill oppose that when he approached it, I guess, is what I'm trying to ask here.
Yeah, so I think what we see is that Churchill underwent a sort of a change of heart, or a change of position, at any rate, in the early 1930s. Now, I'm definitely going to make the argument that what makes the difference is that he, of course, disliked communism in general, but very, very specifically, he disliked Trotsky and Trotskyism. And so what Churchill kind of associated with Trotskyism was was really barbarism and the entire breakdown of all civilized standards. He sort of saw it as chaotic, destructive, and of course, looking at the way in which the Russian Civil War had played out, it's not far from a completely unreasonable point of view. To think that this had led to the Bolshevik Revolution, had led to all sorts of horrible chaos, obviously. And indeed, I'm not going to put it down to the fact that Trotsky gave Churchill a bad book review, which he did in the late 1920s. So Trotsky actually writes a review of Churchill's book, The World Crisis, which was about the period of the World War and sort of spanning the World War. And, Trotsky catches out Churchill in some, slightly silly errors in things which he'd said about Lenin's sort of early life and so forth, and really kind of pours scorn on the entire book. And Churchill, who, of course, well before receiving this bad book review, had been very hostile to Trotsky, so we can't put it all down to that. But Churchill actually responds in his own article with an article which he writes and publishes in a magazine, specifically about Trotsky. Really, he what's very interesting is the language which Churchill uses when he discusses Trotsky and the sort of the Bolshevik state at this time. And so he talks about it as an oozing dung heap. So you can really kind of get this visceral feeling of disgust. Really, you could really sense that. And he uses these kind of disease metaphors. He famously described Lenin in the train that goes back to Russia as a plague bacillus, right? So he's comparing these people to sickness, disease, horrible, disgusting, vile, oozing things, and so when Trotsky is exiled from the Soviet Union, and Stalin is firmly in charge. And of course, Stalin has abandons the policy of sort of world revolution and starts talking about socialism in one country. So what Churchill is particularly terrified of, or particularly disliked, is this idea of sort of Bolshevism spreading throughout the world. Now, if it can be sort of contained within a single country, he's certainly not going to like it. But it becomes less of a serious threat. So what we actually have, and this was one of my interesting discoveries for the chapter, was that although Churchill's well known for writing lots and lots of newspaper articles, and there's a sort of a book which lists everything that Churchill ever wrote, or almost everything that Churchill ever wrote, it's occasionally possible to find stuff which people didn't know about. And I found an article which Churchill had published in August 1931 in an American newspaper, which is actually portraying the Soviet Union as a really big threat. And he's saying they're rearming, it's very dangerous, it's very worrying, in a way saying exactly the same things that just a few years later he was saying about the Nazi regime. Now, it's interesting because he says this, but then he stops saying that. And for about 3 years, you can't really find any really significant comment that he makes about the Soviet Union. And after that point, he doesn't portray the Soviet Union as a threat in the same way until at least after World War II, when things, of course, change again. So there's this period of silence, and then in 1934, he comes out and makes a speech in the House of Commons, which again is really suggesting that it would be a good thing if various Eastern European states and the Soviet Union collaborate, and that this will sort of help restore the peace of Europe. And Daily Express, British right-wing newspaper, publishes an article in response to this, which is headlined, "Mr. Churchill changes his mind. The bogeymen in Moscow are now quite nice." So it is noticed that he has kind of shifted his position. And I think he has shifted his position because he now does actually perceive that Stalin could be a reliable factor in international politics. That is to say, it's not that he thinks that Stalin is a nice guy, but he thinks that he is rational and that he is relatively predictable. Now, of course, Stalin, in Churchill's view, is going to do what is in the interests of the Soviet Union, but where the interests of the Soviet Union and the British Empire coincide, that means that it can be possible for the two countries to collaborate and to work together. And it is the fact that, this will sound very odd, I know, but actually in the later 30s, Churchill concludes that the Soviet Union is becoming less communist, or even moving away from communism. Now, what I think he means there is that it is moving away from Trotskyism and the particular form of communism to which he is so disapproving. And so, actually, when you get to the show trials of the later 30s, and you look at the account of these, which Churchill gives, two things. First of all, he revises his article on Trotsky, and and he's republished in his book Great Contemporaries, and you can sort of see which passages have been left out, and and new passages that have been added. And so we see there that, and this again is echoed in the account which Churchill gives in his post-war memoirs, that Churchill obviously thinks there's something quite odd about the show trials. He doesn't think this is necessarily a brilliant way to go about things, but at the same time, I think that he thinks that maybe there really had been some kind of plot against Stalin, and that the kind of people who are now being targeted by Stalin, sort of the old Bolsheviks, or the people who are associated with Trotsky, or who were being alleged now to be associated with Trotsky. Churchill is thinking, well, yeah, these guys, I think back in the early 20s, they were probably were plotting against the British Empire. Is it impossible that they are now plotting against Stalin? So that this could be a real thing. And so Churchill he's previously used this language of sort of disease, and now he's talking about the poison being extruded, so that he's talking about the show trials as actually a kind of a cleansing or a healthy process by which the kind of the most diseased aspects of communism are being got rid of, and that Soviet Union, and of course people tend this time to talk about Russia when they really mean the Soviet Union. The two terms tend to get used kind of interchangeably. But he actually sees the Soviet Union as moving back and becoming a kind of a more healthy factor in international life, and acting more in the way in which Russia had done as a great power prior to 1917. So, you've got this, again, this belief. I think Churchill really saw things in great power terms, and that when he believed that Russia or the Soviet Union were now acting more like a traditional great power rather than this destructive force, then he's thinking, well, of course, not completely convinced by Stalin. Don't think he's a great guy. I am a bit worried that these show trials may have had an impact on the power of the Red Army, for example. But nonetheless, I think this is somebody who we should be sort of aiming potentially to collaborate with. And then that explains his attitude at the time of the Munich Crisis, that we should have this grand alliance. We should work with both Russia and France in order to take a firm line with Germany, so that hopefully the generals will then move against him, and then we can return to something more like normal pre-Hitler life.
I think that's particularly, again, astute. We look at that in terms of replacing one regime with another, and realizing there is a stabilizing factor, sadly enough. And it's a weird thing to say with Stalin, that there is a stabilizing factor there, and it's certainly more stable than necessarily when you look at Hitler. Kara, did you have a question?
Yeah, no, well, more of commentary. To me, it makes sense why Churchill
does.
would feel that way. Like, it seems natural, because when you look at Trotsky and the elements and the factions of the ex-Bolsheviks that associated with them, they were very into the Comintern and the idea of an international, or internationalist communism. So therefore, if you are Churchill and you're looking at it from a political stance, geopolitically, it makes sense to be more terrified by Trotsky and what he symbolizes, because ideas are powerful. Stalin could seem almost timid in that regard, because he's not Trotsky in the way he's unifying people behind a certain common theme.
It's an animal. Yeah, it's an animal you recognize, if you will. So that is very, very interesting. Man.
And I mean, I suppose, one can take the story through as well to the war years and the post-war years to a certain extent, insofar as obviously, in fact, Churchill did work quite effectively with Stalin for 4 years. It was difficult there was a lot of cajoling and kind of sort of angry telegrams on both sides. It wasn't exactly a love-in, but of course they did meet on a number of occasions. Personally, they got on, kind of reasonably well, and so. And I should say I've had interesting conversations with Gabriel Gorodetsky, who's the author of the chapter on specifically on the Soviet Union in the book as well. A very distinguished historian and the editor of the diaries of Ivan Maisky, who was the Soviet ambassador to Britain at this time, who Churchill was having a lot of discussions with. Now, Gabriel and quite a lot of other historians now do think that Stalin was, in terms of foreign policy, a reasonably rational actor who, of course, sort of pushed the envelope in trying to get advantages for his own country. But when he made agreements, he certainly was capable of sticking to them. And I think that in a way is sort of the big difference in some ways between Hitler and Stalin from the point of view of these geopolitical decisions that you were talking about, which is, of course, Stalin was a mass murderer. Who committed awful crimes, but unlike Hitler, he sort of knew his limits when it came to in foreign policy. Now, in a sense, I suppose the thing which still puzzles me and which nobody has really quite been able to explain to me amongst the Soviet experts is that on the one hand you've got Stalin acting in a reasonably rational and predictable manner at the international level, and yet you also have these purges which, well, I mean, perhaps they're sort of somewhat rational in the sense of trying to maintain yourself in power, but they still seem sort of very, very excessive even to do that, and do also seem to be the product of genuine paranoia. So no, I've not quite got my head around this dichotomy between the reasonably rational, predictable international Stalin and the kind of the paranoid, controlling, totally murderous sort of domestic Stalin.
That's an excellent point. I have never considered that. Yes. Oh, wow. I had
the
not
dichotomy.
That.
Yeah.
It's really, really interesting. But also, it's interesting to look at the international, when you look at the approach to foreign policy, he is predictable. That's really interesting. Wow. I'm very excited about this book, especially when like really and truly, this is going to be a new look at it and something I don't think a lot of people consider. Kara, yes.
No, I'm just thinking. I mean, I know my eyes look like I want to talk, but I'm just thinking at the moment. But one thing that I was observing, and maybe we don't know for sure how Stalin felt, even like you said, speaking with historians or reading versions of events, but there's a part of me that wonders, think about how Hitler was being closely monitored by the global community during this time. If Stalin laid low, and given there's incidences such as the Spanish Civil War where he did get moderately involved, if he laid low and avoided too much notice from a global level, wouldn't that be more beneficial for the Soviet Union? Kind of let other geopolitical battles linger.
Well,
and
I mean, I suppose the other thing which comes out from Gabriel's chapter is that it argues that actually this was a possibly viable solution. Not, as I say, not necessarily that would have worked in stopping Hitler. I mean, that's kind of a different question. But the Soviet Union might genuinely have been willing to collaborate with Britain and France in an effort to stop Hitler at this time. And I think it's also worth kind of, a theme. We kind of start the book with an introduction which looks back at a book published by a guy called Emery Reeves just after World War II. Emery Reeves was actually Churchill's press agent, amongst other things, but he wrote a book which went sort of viral, if you like, in terms of the 1940s, in terms of getting kind of celebrity endorsements from people like Einstein, called The Anatomy of Peace. And what he does at the start of the book is he doesn't just look at the Munich crisis, he touches upon the Munich crisis, but he looks at the whole perspective of the European crisis from the point of view of the major powers, and writes the story from each of their points of view to make each, to show how each country feels totally justified, morally justified in the approach which it had taken. So it's very clever. So we kind of just extract from that what people had said about the Munich crisis, but that actually persists. So again, if you look at how people think about the Munich crisis in Russia today, for example, well, actually Vladimir Putin wrote a long article which came out in 2020, which looks at quite well informed in many ways, sort of historically based article. Now, from Putin's perspective, what does he think about the Munich crisis? Well, he sees this as being a moment where the British and French together looked to their own security interests and ignored or excluded the Soviet Union from the discussions. Remember that the Munich conference was between Germany, Italy, France, and Russia, with sort of really settling the affairs of Czechoslovakia over the heads of the Czechs, but with no chair for the Soviet Union, and so from the point of view of a kind of a Russian nationalist, well, this is the Munich crisis evidence that the Western powers were sort of trying to exclude or to even encircle the Soviet Union. And so from that point of view, that allows you to move to offer a justification for the Nazi-Soviet pact, which is to say, well, look, we were just doing what we believed was in our own security interests in 1939 in exactly the same way that the British and the French had done in Munich in 1938. Well, I don't really think myself that that's quite a legitimate interpretation of what the British and French were trying to do. Of course, they were taking their own security interests into account, but and equally, in Britain and France, one tends to see this today not as a justifiable action at Munich, but rather as a sort of a shameful event or as a sign of weakness, of appeasement, and so on. But it does remind us, however dubious Putin's interpretation may be, it reminds us that there are different ways of looking at this crisis, and it looks very different from the perspective of all sorts of different countries.
I think that's really interesting, because we have a particular viewpoint that we look at when we look at Munich, and we look at going through this. We tend to hone in on whatever our specific approach is. And I think it's really interesting in this book that you guys kind of explore this through a bunch of different lenses. And that's why I think it's going to be something really different from what people are used to reading and what the normal approach is. It's going to be really, really interesting. I'm very, very excited to get my hands on this and actually dive in. It's an interesting approach. I mean, where did you guys come from when you were sitting down putting this all together? Where did the idea come from to essentially approach this through a bunch of different lenses versus the lens that we're used to? What was the impetus, if you will?
Well, I mean, I think that on the one hand, we've got the movement been going on for several decades now of trying to use sources such as those of the sociological research organization Mass Observation to look at ordinary people's views of all sorts of things. Now, listeners may or may not know of Mass Observation, but it was this incredible organization which was founded in 1937 their slogan was the science of ourselves. So they kind of wanted to find out about ordinary people, and not just in a quantitative way, not just opinion polling as was developing in America and Britain at that time, of saying, do you approve of President Roosevelt or not, but to generate material which was kind of richer and more qualitative. I mean, they did crazy stuff, like they went to football matches and took photos of the football matches to then counted how many of the people were wearing hats, right? So they wanted to know all sorts of kind of weird and wacky stuff, but also people's reactions to big political events. So on the one, and of course there are sources from other countries as well. We have a chapter on Italy. And sources there, people were writing to Mussolini, and in the sort of aftermath of the crisis, and revealing their views. Of course, they weren't criticizing Mussolini. You probably wouldn't dare to write saying
Dear
that.
Mussolini.
Duce, you suck. Love Massimo. You wouldn't do that. But what's interesting, of course, is that people were expressing views which actually weren't really in line with the views of the regime, or the views that the regime wanted them to express. The regime wanted them to be incredibly warlike, so that when they said, what a relief that war's not coming, that war has been averted, this wasn't really, the people didn't think they were criticizing the regime, but the regime wasn't necessarily that pleased with the sort of the revelation that people actually kind of quite like peace and weren't really gearing up to fight a fascist war in the way that the regime might have hoped. So all around the world, there are these different ways of looking at popular opinion, which I think was one motivation. But equally, our motivation was also to look at it from a more psychological point of view, if you like. And this, I think, is where the book seems quite relevant in the light of the COVID crisis. That this is a time where people were fearing for their lives. It's a different form of fear. There was, of course, this widespread belief that aerial bombardment would lead to pretty much literally the end of civilization. And, of course, in retrospect, we know that populations could survive a surprising amount of bombing without a complete breakdown in morale. But of course, being bombed, it nevertheless is a very horrible thing, even if society continues to some extent. So that that sort of incredible tension, of course, which then explains the sheer relief which people feel when war is averted. Their sort of almost kind of ecstatic feeling of relief that they're not going to die. Now, of course, COVID has played out in a very different way, and that too has played out in different ways in different countries. It's a different kind of fear, but it's still this sort of intangible fear that something very, very unpleasant could happen to you or your loved ones. And of course, it's been going on longer than the Munich crisis went on. There's never going to be a moment where we can definitively say COVID is over. Retrospectively, we'll be looking for where the turning point was. Where was the point where things, what was the signal that things had sort of got back to normal in some way? But so that we've just kind of been reflecting on how people's reactions to these kind of extreme stress situations, how there might be something to learn from, comparing international foreign policy crises and a pandemic.
Wow. Certainly would. Oh God. Again, I can't tell people enough. Go out, buy all of Richard's books. They're going to just change the way you think and approach a lot of different things. But I think that's very interesting and something we haven't seen, sort of the common man's thought process and approach to something like the Munich crisis. And I don't think there is a lot out there that's going to necessarily, you're going to get your hands on, that's going to approach this particular moment in international politics this way. So that is really, really interesting. And I'm very excited to read it, obviously.
It's very nuanced. That's what I like about
Yes.
the way that you guys are going about it. It's a different approach to something that's been covered a lot. And I like the idea of using those psychological mentionings that you were doing. It reminded me a little bit of, there's an author, Barbara Starkey, and she has published several writings that include a lot of primary accounts from the 1930s and 40s from women. And I assume a lot of the translation could have stemmed from a similar movement to, as you were describing, to get the ordinary civilians' thoughts on, well, how do you feel about being a woman getting employed after the 5-year plan, or something so nuanced like that. So I'm excited about it in any case.
Yeah, it's going to be great. Again, don't just go out and grab this book. Richard has a number of books that you could go out and grab. I mean, my goodness, my bookshelf has certainly gotten the Richard Toye treatment, an entire, shelf in and of itself. So, Richard, we're going to go ahead and wrap up, I think, here. Why don't you tell us where we're going to be able to grab this book, kind of, and then maybe plug some of your other work, if you would like to, where we find and follow you as well, so that everybody can get everything there.
So the book is, I will repeat the title, so it's called The Munich Crisis, Politics and the People. It's edited by me, Daniel Hucker, and Julie Gottlieb, and it is published by Manchester University Press, so available on every platform on which you can buy books or ebooks. And so you can follow me on Twitter at Richard Toye. That's Richard Toye. You can also follow at Julie V Gottlieb, Gottlieb. Dan isn't on Twitter, but we always mention him in our tweets to make sure he gets his share of the credit. And so I think those are really the main channels. Although if you like looking at pretty photographs, you can follow me on Instagram as well, Richard _John_Toye. So that's kind of more pictures of forests and mountains and parts of Venice, but so kind of different kind of stuff.
Absolutely. Well, we cannot thank you enough, Richard, for going ahead and being with us. I'm pretty excited. This is, again, a little something that I am, I'm used to when I'm reading your books, looking through things in that Churchill lens, and we are still in a way doing that. But this is going to be a little something different, maybe a little out of the way from what I'm used to reading from you, and it's going to be fantastic. I'm very excited about this book. It's something different. I think our readers, our listeners, and our readers are going to be very excited to look at this. Yeah, because our listeners are readers, so that's exciting.
Well, thank you very much for having me on the show.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. That being said, we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. Normally, Kara and I would do our spiel, but we're going to save our listeners for that. Again, you can find and follow the show at Body Count Pod on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, bodycounthistorypod.com to listen to this episode and all of our episodes. And again, we ask you go and rate and review. That being said, thank you so much, Richard. We appreciate you. It was absolutely fantastic.
Well, thank you again.
Thank you. It was very nice.